willing to do whatever need be to advance American corporate interests globally, and I think there is a parallel, certainly with today's foreign policy. I don't want to give people the impression that this is just something that just started in 2006 when Stephen Harper was elected. It predates that. It actually has long history, but it is certainly something that is getting more and more intense with the Harper government of a foreign policy structured around Canadian corporate interests and Western imperial interests. And a first place that we can look at to see some of that is a recent trip that Stephen Harper made to Israel with a couple hundred of his closest friends, paid for by our tax dollars, to visit Israel, where he made sure to this is kind of a symbol of this what has been a deepening of relations between Canada and Israel that is against international opinion. On the trip, he refused to talk about settlements, even though official Canadian policy is that the settlements are illegal. Of course, according to international law, all Israeli settlements in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, are contrary to international law. That's very clear. Even the Canadian government ostensibly believes that, but the Harper government refused to say anything about the issue at hand. In fact, not long after returning, Jason Kenney, the Minister of Employment, went out of his way to purchase a SodaStream fizzy drink thing, I guess is what SodaStream makes. They make these, of course, in a settlement, illegally occupied settlement. There's a boycott of SodaStream. There's a big international scandal with Scarlett Johansson and her promotion of SodaStream. And our minister, in light of this growing boycott, he made sure to go out of his way to go buy a SodaStream product, to post it on his Twitter account, and to be really an activist in what the extreme pro-Israel sectors in this country call the boycott. When people boycott Israeli products, we have to go out of our way to buy them, even if we have no interest in those products. So we see this really over-the-top, extreme pro-Israel policy of the Harper government. On this trip to Israel, little was discussed about the deepening of the Canada-Israel border security agreement. As far as I know, Canada does not share a border with Israel, yet they are deepening this security agreement. They're deepening military ties with Israel. Of course, during Israel's bombing of Lebanon in 2006, the Harper government went out of its way to justify Israel's bombing against international opinion. And there's example after example at different United Nations forums of the Canadian government voting in favor or against resolutions that are supported by basically the whole world. Like literally there'll be 160 to 15 abstaining, and 4 countries, Canada, Israel, the US, and Micronesia, that will vote against these resolutions. One part of this, and it's important to know when we talk about the theme here of this talk is that what's happening to the reputation, and this is becoming understood. Canada's position is becoming understood. When John Baird spoke at the UN during the Palestinian statehood bid about a year and a half ago, there was a video that was shown, and he was the only speaker, only diplomat who didn't receive any applause from the after speaking from the international diplomats. Similarly, around the same time, there was a demonstration in Ramallah to where the Canadian diplomatic representative in Ramallah, where Palestinians had a big poster of placard with Harper's face on it, next to the dismissive slogan, "This dog doesn't hunt," about Stephen Harper. So it's not like this is just something understood in Canada. This is understood globally what Canada's position is on this issue. One element of this trip to Israel that I do want to highlight, because our media is so incredible in their reporting was that during the trip to Israel 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was announced that Canada had given $66 million to the Palestinians. Right? It was like, okay, well, yes, he's really pro-Israel. Yes, he's receiving a prize from the Jewish National Fund, which has explicitly racist land covenants, which excludes non-Jews from its land. This is something out of the 1950s in this country, or the Jim Crow South in the U.S. And so, yes, he's receiving a prize from the Jewish National Fund that's been involved in the dispossession of Palestinians for over a century. Yes, he's bringing all these delegates, but at least he's giving $66 million in Canadian aid to the Palestinians. This is, a symbol. This is what was reported in our media. Well, what's this aid to the Palestinians? They call it aid. What is it? Well, what we know is that in 2006, when Hamas won the legislative elections, Canada was the first country to cut off aid to the Palestinian Authority because Hamas had won democratic elections. There was a Palestinian Unity government. Once Hamas was kicked out of the Palestinian Unity government, Canada began a 5-year, $300 million aid program to the Palestinians. Most of this money, according to Peter Kent, who was then Deputy Foreign Minister, most of this money goes to security reform, to building up a Palestinian security force to essentially oversee Israel's occupation of the West Bank. This is a force overseen by a U.S. general, trained in Jordan, Canadians, Brits, Americans involved in the training, at a facility the Americans built after invading Iraq, where they were training Iraqi security forces after the invasion of Iraq. And this is the bulk of what Canada's aid has been, and almost certainly is continued of the $66 million, is to building up the security force. This is what Margaret Biggs, the president of CEDA, explained in November of 2012 about Canada's aid to the Palestinians and the security reform that's taking place. Because after the Palestinians went for their statehood bid, the Canadian government said it was going to cut off aid to the Palestinians if they pursued the statehood bid. That was the threat that the Canadian government made to the Palestinian Authority. Margaret Biggs, and this is an internal CEDA document, she said, there have been increasing references in the past months during high-level bilateral meetings with the Israelis about the importance and value they place on Canada's assistance to the Palestinian Authority, most notably in security justice reform. Essentially, she's saying we shouldn't cut off the aid to the Palestinians because the Israelis want us to give this aid because they support this security force in the West Bank that is doing their security work, that is doing their dirty work. That the Palestinian Authority, of course, has no electoral mandate. Abbas's electoral mandate ended in 2009. Highly corrupt, highly compliant in the face of ongoing Israeli settlement building. But Margaret Biggs didn't just stop there saying Israel wants us to give us aid to Palestinians. This is what she went on and said. That she actually put this on paper, which I'm flabbergasted at the stupidity. She said, quote, "The emergence of popular protests on the Palestinian street against the Palestinian Authority is worrying, and the Israelis have been imploring the international donor community to continue to support the Palestinian Authority." In other words, Palestinians are protesting their unelected, corrupt administration's compliance in the face of Israeli expansionism, and our aid money is going to putting down those protests, right? To propping up the security force of the Palestinian Authority to stop them from protesting against the Palestinian Authority. And she puts this in writing. This is an internal document. This was reported on by Post Media about 6 months ago. All of the Canadian media was aware of this when they talked about the $66 million in Canadian aid to the Palestinian Authority. But that, of course, is not part of the story. We are just trying to help the Palestinians out by giving them hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to prop up corrupt, compliant political factions. Shifting gears, also during his trip in Israel, Harper went out of his way to say that the military's overthrowing of the elected president, Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, that was, quote, return to stability. That is a return to stability that has led to thousands of people, literally thousands of people that have been killed in demonstrations. Whatever you want to say about the government that was in place, and there's clearly lots to criticize, it was elected. What we are seeing is a return to military rule in Egypt, and we have the Harper government supporting that rhetorically. Months back in August, John Baird said, "We're certainly not calling for them, Egypt's elected government, to, quote, to be restored to power." Even the U.S., France, and UK have nominally called for the return of the democratically elected president in Egypt. They've justified the killing, demonstrators repeatedly being killed. But this flows from the Harper government's position on the Arab Spring pro-democracy movement. When over a month of protests in Tunisia to get rid of dictatorship of Ben Ali, the 23-year dictatorship of Ben Ali, the Harper government supported Ben Ali to the last minutes of that, refusing to condemn, refusing to call Ben Ali to go. Likewise, in Egypt with Hosni Mubarak and his 3-decade-long dictatorship, literally hours before Mubarak had announced that he was stepping down, Harper was endorsing Mubarak's transition plan, which was being opposed by basically everyone at that point. So they have a deep hostility towards democracy in the Arab world. The Harper government has shown that very clearly over and over again. One issue that receives a certain amount of attention, that it deserves, I think, a bit more discussion, is the low-level war against Iran that this country has been waging for the past few years. It's rarely referred to as a low-level war, but I think that's what it is. We have Canadian naval vessels patrolling off the coast of Iran, running provocative maneuvers, and we know that there's going to be Canadian naval deployment in the Persian Gulf until at least April of 2015. We have Canada musing about war. We have Peter MacKay, who sort of talked about threatened invasion. We have the Canadian government cutting off all diplomatic relations with Iran, which is often seen as the step before a full-scale military invasion. So even we have a sanctions campaign. We have the Harper government labeling Iran a state sponsor of terrorism in 2012, and the sanctions campaign that the Canadian government has waged against Iran, which are so extreme that a year and a half ago, Iranian Canadians who have bank accounts with Toronto Dominion had their bank accounts severed by Toronto Dominion because they had a family in Iran that they were sending money to, or they were receiving a pension from Iran, and so Toronto Dominion was nervous that they were going to not adhere to Canada's sanctions, and so they'd actually just withdrawing dozens and dozens, I don't know what the exact number was, of Iranian and Canadians' bank accounts. The sanctions campaign, so in recent months, when there's been some negotiations, clearly elements of the Obama administration are trying to minimize the possibility of a full-scale war with Iran. And so there's been some reducing of sanctions. The Harper government has been immediately saying we will not reduce any of our sanctions against Iran. So staking out a position to the right of the P5 countries and to the right of the Obama administration on this issue, and really aligning Canadian policy clearly with Netanyahu's Israel on the question of Iran and trying to destabilize Iran, and this has real human consequences. These sanctions, there's been a number of reports, a number of stories about driving costs of basic foodstuffs. Right? What does that mean for poor people? That means poor people having a harder time getting milk, harder time getting certain basic foodstuffs. And this whole campaign against Iran is ostensibly because Iran is possibly building nuclear weapons, right? That's this whole campaign. That's why we have these sanctions. That's why we're cutting off diplomatic ties, on and on and on. Yet Israel has 100 to 200 nuclear weapons. The U.S. has about 5,000. The U.S. spends, according to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, over $60 billion a year on its nuclear program. That's about 4 or 5 times Iran's entire military budget. That's as much as the rest of the world spends on nuclear related military materials. So this campaign against Iran is flagrant double standards. We don't care about Israel's nuclear weapons. In fact, the Harper government has voted against resolutions at the International Atomic Energy Agency that are supported by the whole world, calling for Israel to bring its nuclear weapons program under IAEA controls. We don't care about Israel's nuclear weapons. We don't care about American nuclear weapons, which are even in the region, of course. But we're really worried about Iran's possible nuclear weapons. The other part of this campaign against Iran is that Iran is a human rights violator, which I think that it's hard to argue against the fact that there are significant human rights violations, that there are significant democratic deficiencies in Iran. That's beyond dispute. Yet the Harper government is so concerned about Iran's human rights violations, but next door with Saudi Arabia, right? We have in 2011, Canada sent, or the Harper government okayed $4 billion in Canadian weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, right? Mostly light armored vehicles that the Saudis actually used when they invaded Bahrain in 2011 to help put down the pro-democracy protests in Bahrain. We have repeated visits, like it's just every couple months, a minister of the Harper government is visiting Saudi Arabia to deepen economic and political ties with Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, comparing Saudi Arabia to Iran, on the democracy question, Iran looks like it's a absolute beacon of democracy. On the question of women's rights, it looks like it's absolute beacon of women's rights. On the question of religious minorities, likewise, etc., etc. And in a recent example of this deepening of ties with Saudi Arabia and the Harper government's really aligning its policy, sort of a symbolic example of aligning its policy with Saudi Arabia and against Iran. You even had John Baird referring to the water between Iraq and Iran, which the whole world understands as the Persian Gulf. He's referring to it now as the Arabian Gulf, which is just a symbol of aligning. Obviously, Persia, Iran is the as the Persian Iran or the same thing in a sense. So you have just this very symbolic example of this policy of attacking Iran, deepening ties with this monarchy in Saudi Arabia that's probably one of the most repressive regimes in the world. But we really care about human rights in Iran. Shifting gears geographically to a little bit closer to home, there was a recent meeting last week of the Community of Latin American Caribbean States. It represents all of the countries of the hemisphere, except for 2. Which 2 countries might those be? The U.S. and Canada. So increasingly from Jamaica to Chile, Argentina to Guatemala, there is a sense that we're norte americanos, right? Really in that
North Americans, unfortunately for Mexicans in this one, but are pushed out or seen as something, and that's symbolic. So the Community of Latin American Caribbean States began, I think it's 4 years ago now. Canada has been excluded for all the meetings, and there's reasons for this. It's not just geographic reasons. There's political reasons. So in 2009, when the military overthrew the elected government in Honduras, Canada was one of the Manuel Zelaya, sort of a leftish social democratic government. Canada was one of the only countries to deepen or to continue ties with the military regime, to continue the military training assistance program with Honduras, to repeatedly make comments in favor or to blame Zelaya for the military overthrowing him. And that was, hundreds of people were killed in the aftermath of that. One of the things they did after the coup was to sign a Canada-Honduras free trade agreement to protect the Canadian mining interests operating in Honduras. Canada has helped to actually rewrite Honduras's mining code to better serve foreign, mostly Canadian mining interests. In 2012, in June of 2012, there was a coup, a removal of the elected president, Fernando Lugo, again a social democratic president that ended six decades of one-party rule in Paraguay. Canada was one of the only countries to immediately recognize the new government. Mercosur and UNASUR, the body of Latin America, South American countries, refused to recognize the new government in Paraguay. The Harper government immediately went to recognize the government, and by chance there was one of the political issues that kind of spurred the coup was major interests of Rio Tinto Alcan that had was looking for a subsidy for a multi-billion-dollar. That's a Montreal-based company looking for subsidies for a multi-billion-dollar aluminum processing operation in Paraguay. We had announced, came out via Edward Snowden and Robert Greenwald, that the Communications Security Establishment, the foreign spying arm of the Canadian government, that has a couple thousand employees in Ottawa, and it's been mostly secretive. It's come more information about it recently. The spying on Brazil's mining ministry, apparently to advance the interests of Canadian mining and possibly oil companies operating in Brazil. And that certainly wouldn't have made, or it certainly didn't make Canada very popular in Brazil. I'm going to read you a quote from a senator in Haiti, Moïse Jean-Charles, somebody I had a chance to meet in Haiti a few years ago. He's quoted in November of this year in Haiti Liberté newspaper saying, this is after Uruguay removed its troops as part of the UN mission in Haiti. He said, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay are not the real occupiers of Haiti. The real forces behind Haiti's UN-administered military occupation, the powers which are really putting everybody else up to it, are the US, France, and Canada, which colluded in the February 29, 2004 coup d'etat against President Jean-Bertrand Aristide. It was then they began trampling on Haitian sovereignty. This is reported on, but this is probably maybe the most popular politician in Haiti at the moment, saying this, saying that Canada is putting other countries up to militarily occupying Haiti. That, for most Canadians, that sounds like this guy is just a totally crazy, what in the world is he talking about? But that's because in this country, we don't hear that if you read Haiti Liberté or Haiti Progrès magazine, newspapers, weekly newspapers, Haitian weeklies, they, over the past 10 years, have referred to Canada as an imperialist, as an occupier, 100 I don't know exactly how many times, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times, often multiple times in one issue of the newspaper. That never makes it, or basically never makes it into media, the dominant media in this country. And this isn't the Harper government. This is the 10th, we're coming towards the 10th anniversary of the coup d'etat in Haiti, where Canadian, American, primarily American, French troops invaded the country. And American troops literally kidnapped the elected president and dumped him in the Central African Republic. Put him on a plane and just literally flew him halfway across the world. And just then there were over 500 Canadian troops that occupied the country, that were there for, they were there until there was a UN mandate about 6 months later. A UN force then replaced the American and French. Canadian troops actually stayed on. We know that 13 months before the coup in Haiti, that there was a meeting held in Ottawa, which was termed the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. It was reported on in March of 2003. So 1 year before the coup, L'Actualité magazine, which is Quebec's equivalent to Maclean's magazine, reported that the Canadian government organized a meeting in Ottawa where they decided that Aristide must go, so the elected president must go, that Haiti should be put under UN tutelage, and the Haitian army should be recreated. 13 months later, Aristide was overthrown. Haiti has been under UN tutelage since that time, and the Haitian army has sort of been recreated, or there's been elements of the recreation of the Haitian army. So the Canadian government was heavily involved in the overthrow of an elected president in Haiti. There were thousands of people that were killed in the aftermath of the coup, with Canadian military involved in supporting the Haitian forces that were doing it, with Canadian police involved in training and funding the Haitian police forces that were going into the slum neighborhoods and massacring those who were seen as supportive of the ousted government, firing on pro-Aristide demonstrations, etc. That's most people in this room, or some people in this room, are probably familiar a little bit with what happened in Haiti, but most people are probably not that familiar because it's basically unreported in the dominant media in this country. People are probably a bit more familiar with the earthquake in Haiti, right? Terrible. Not exactly clear how many people died, but as many as a couple 100,000 people died 4 years ago. After the earthquake, anyone who watched the news were appalled and horrified by what had happened, and vast majority of us that have any humanity in us were hopeful that there were people that could help get people out of under the rubble, that could get water to people, that could get food in the aftermath, in the horror of the aftermath. We know that officials in Ottawa had a very different concern. According to internal documents uncovered from accessed information, an internal government marked secret, this was reported on by the Canadian press, about right after the earthquake. It said, quote, "Political fragility has increased the risks of popular uprising and has fed the rumor that ex-President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, currently in exile in South Africa, wants to organize a return to power." And then it goes on to say the importance of Canada strengthening the Haitian authorities, quote, "to contain the risks of a popular uprising." So after the earthquake, Canada sent 2,000 troops to Haiti. The heavy urban search and rescue teams that are designed, that in the case of natural disasters, to search for people who may be caught, to provide basic health, to provide water services, etc. The heavy urban search and rescue teams that are based in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg, a few other cities, were readied but never sent to Haiti. Instead, we sent 2,000 troops. Because why? Because we weren't, not us in this room, I think probably us in this room probably were, but the decision makers in Ottawa weren't concerned with how do we help people who are hurt. They were concerned with maybe this popular elected, ousted president that's in exile in South Africa, maybe the pro-democracy forces in the aftermath of the earthquake will galvanize and bring a return to this ousted president. That's what we have it in writing, the internal documents showing that was the concern, and that's why we sent 2,000 troops, not heavy urban search and rescue teams and other forms of support. And of course, Haitians are not unaware of that being Canada's orientation to their country. Shifting gears to an issue that I think is fundamental in understanding the more rightward, the more aggressive shift in Canadian foreign policy, which is the incredible rise of the mining sector in this country. Canadian mining companies have more than $200 billion invested abroad. As much as 75% of the world's mining companies are listed on Canadian stock exchanges. And these companies are involved in social conflict all around the world, right? You pretty much can pick any country in the global south and you will find an example of a Canadian operated mine in conflict with a local community, having led to people being killed. It led to ecological damage, etc., etc. So they're very unpopular. Many Canadian companies are very unpopular globally, and the Canadian government is very concerned with advancing the interests of these Canadian companies, right? And opposing, there was a legislation that was brought forward, Bill C-300, that would have ended public support for Canadian mining companies found to be engaged in abuses abroad. That was voted down primarily by the Conservatives, but also by the Liberals, some Liberals, even though it was a Liberal member of Parliament's private members bill, that voted down the Bill C-300 to try to put some restrictions on Canadian mining companies' abuses abroad. You have the Canadian government signing foreign investment promotion protection agreements with countries all throughout Africa, Latin America, all around the world, in large part to advance the interests of Canadian mining companies, to protect the investments of Canadian mining companies. You have Canadian government setting up diplomatic relations with countries to protect the interests, Mongolia specifically, to protect the interests of Canadian mining companies operating there. You have the Canadian government even spending $25 million on a wonderful institute at this base at this university, Canadian International Institute for Extractive Development. Our aid money going to setting up this institute, which is really designed to advance the interests of Canadian mining companies abroad, that has mining companies that are part of it. I'm sure people in this room, many people in this room can get more into detail about that institute, and it's a prime example of a campaign. The campaign around the institute here is a prime example of bringing the macro of Canadian foreign policy and taking a specific target to challenge or to struggle against for people who are associated with UBC. So the rise of the Canadian mining sector and all the conflict that's come with that with Canadian mining companies abroad, I think this is a very important component in the rightward shift of Canadian foreign policy, because basically Canadian mining companies, the rise of Canadian mining companies, which in 1989 there was less than $250 million in Canadian mining investment in Africa. That's gone to over $31 billion. In same time with Mexico, gone from basically no Canadian mining companies operating in Mexico before NAFTA Now it's into the hundreds. So this is quick, 20 years, 30 years, rapid rise. And that's been because of reforms, neoliberal reforms that have opened up countries' natural resource sector to foreign companies, that has led to the privatization of state-owned mines, that has reduced royalty rates. And Canadian mining companies are concerned that nationalistic, socialistic forces in Africa, in Latin America, will push back against these neoliberal reforms. One of the first things that sort of socialistic movements and governments tend to do is increase royalty rates on mining companies, to nationalize natural resources. And so I think that's led to the Canadian government being much more aggressive, obviously in the mining sector specifically, but just more generally led to a more aggressive orientation because there's these major sectors of Canadian corporate world that see their interests, hundreds of billions of dollars of their investments, tied to this very open, extreme pro-capitalist orientation around the world that's taken hold over the past 20, 25 years. Another element, or the last element of Canadian foreign policy that has, and I should say, as the video shows, and that video I think was produced by a half dozen fairly mainstream NGOs. It's just an example of the deterioration of Canada's reputation. It's real. There's really large parts of this world now where Canadian companies have been in so much conflict with local communities. They're so rejected by local communities, and that translates onto their perception of Canada. And one example, actually, just to mention, in Costa Rica, there's a Calgary-based company, Infinito Gold, which has just launched a $1 billion, a few months ago now, $1 billion suit against the government of Costa Rica, and for refusing to okay its mine. This is the mine that's open pit mine that has been rejected by the courts in Costa Rica, a series of different courts. By chance, the leading investor in the mining company happened to give $200,000 to the foundation of the then president, who okayed the mining concession, apparently against, according to the Costa Rican courts, against the law in Costa Rica. And so this Canadian company, through a foreign investment promotion protection agreement, has sued Costa Rica for $1 billion for not accepting its horribly destructive, ecologically destructive mine. And there's more than 300,000 people that have signed a petition condemning this lawsuit. Right, so this is not just Canadians signing. This is people all around the world, and there's a growing consciousness about just how destructive Canadian mining operations are globally, and it's no doubt had a major impact on this country's international reputation. Probably the issue that has had the most negative impact on Canada's global reputation, and the issue that is I would say the most destructive in Canadian foreign policy of recent years, is the climate criminality of the Harper government. And those the people who had that action a couple months ago here in Vancouver when Harper spoke, very good action. We need a lot more of those types of actions, but I don't think we need placards behind Harper's head that says, what were the exact words now? The Harper government cares about climate, and then have it crossed out was one of them, and the other one was, forgetting it now. We need placards that go behind them that says, climate criminal. Let's be clear in what's going on here. The Climate Vulnerability Monitor talks about 400,000 people that are dying every year because of climate disturbances already. That's expected to hit 1 million people by 2020. This is not Canadians, of course. This is some of the most vulnerable people unfortunately, or maybe ironically, or unjustly, in places that are responsible for very limited amounts of the carbon emissions. Places, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, some of the most vulnerable people. That's who's being impacted. Philippines, with some of the so-called natural disasters. And the Harper government has been almost beyond belief in their opposition to minimal attempts to reduce carbon emissions. A couple months ago, The Guardian, after Australia's new right-wing government eliminated its carbon tax, The Guardian reported on Canada's response, a celebratory response to this. The Guardian headline said, quote, "Canada reveals climate stance with praise for Australian carbon tax repeal. Canada discourages other industrialized nations from following through on their own climate change commitments." That's just one example of innumerable of people protesting when Canadian ministers are in England, people protesting Peter Kent and other Canadian ministers for their lobbying on behalf of the tar sands, for their opposition to the Kyoto Protocol. We have even countries like France and Brazil and China and others, that South Africa, India, that all condemned Canada's, the Harper government's pulling Canada out of the Kyoto Protocol. We have example after example of international diplomats at the different UN climate change negotiation meetings, international diplomats condemning Canada's policy. We have the Canadian government receiving the colossal fossil given out by climate or environmental groups at the negotiating meetings for the country doing the most to obstruct efforts to move forward with international program. We have the Canadian government running incredibly aggressive lobbying campaigns in the US and in Europe in favor of tar sands interests. In the case of the US, the United States, what do they call it? The US United States Oil Sands Advocacy Strategy, to lobbying against low carbon fuel standard, which is something that California had brought in, trying to have tar sands excluded from the low carbon fuel standard, which was designed to reduce carbon emissions and fuel sources. Going to state houses that were discussing adopting similar legislation to California's low carbon fuel standard and telling them, if you pass this low carbon fuel standard, you will be dependent on Hugo Chavez for your oil. Not good Canadians, not good Albertans, should I say. In Europe, unfortunately, they've had a big success against the Fuel Quality Directive. The Harper government, incredibly aggressive campaign against the Fuel Quality Directive, which they've worked with Total, the French oil company, Shell, BP, British Petroleum, coordinated this campaign against the Fuel Quality Directive, which again is designed to reduce carbon emissions, to clean up transport fuels. And just recently, the European Union announced that they are not going to adopt new Fuel Quality Directive after 2020. So this has been the goal of the Canadian government's campaign, which Satu Hassi, a Finnish member of the European Parliament, told Reuters 2 years ago, quote, referring to Canada's lobbying campaign against the Fuel Quality Directive. She said, quote, "There have been massive lobbying campaigns by the car industry, by the chemicals industry, banks, food giants, etc. But so far, I have not seen such a lobbying campaign by any state," referring to Canada's efforts, threatening to sue Europe at the WTO, on and on and on. And unfortunately, a success for global humanity, that Europe will be open to dirty tar sands interests, and Europe will not adopt new and better standards for dirty transport fuels. That's the success. That's what our government is doing. That's a day-to-day. What our diplomats are doing in Europe is making sure that it's not just, right now, there's basically no tar sands oil that even makes its way to Europe. Right? It's just the symbol that would, to define tar sands oil as heavy emitting fuel source, the symbol that would give to other places, that's mostly what the Conservative government is concerned about. They're not even actually sending very, very little amount. There's possibility of a little bit more. But there's basically, at this point, no tar sands oil going there. But they are lobbying, probably spending millions of Canadian taxpayers' dollars to lobby against attempts to reduce dirty oil in Europe. And in the case of the U.S. with the Keystone XL pipeline, my estimate is over $100 million now that the Canadian government has spent in the campaign in the U.S. And that's not the private money that TransCanada has been spending. That goes into the tens of millions, of course, on top of that. Just public money. It's an incredible amount of effort. It's the number one thing that the Canadian diplomats, the embassies, the consulates, all 20 plus Canadian consulates across the U.S., they spend their day lobbying for dirty tar sands interests, even though, like I mentioned already, science suggests that humanity is literally on the precipice of serious disaster, and there's already serious toll that many people are facing from climate disturbances. Moving towards a conclusion, unbelievably to me, according to Leger Marketing, 59% of respondents to a poll from about 4 months ago, 59% of Canadians were unaware that the Conservative government had withdrawn Canada from the Kyoto Protocol. So most Canadians don't even know that this country, this government, has withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol. And same poll showed that nearly 60% of Canadians want climate change to be a top issue for the government, and 76% believe Canada should sign on to new international agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So the vast majority of people, or the majority of people, don't even know that they've done this with the Kyoto Protocol, let alone getting into the low carbon fuel standards they're lobbying against, let alone their opposition in Europe, let alone all this other active opposition to attempts to reduce carbon emissions. They don't even know about the Kyoto Protocol. So this is, on one level, very troubling and disconcerting that most people are unaware of Canada withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol. But on the other hand, it's actually quite an opportunity, because we know, according to polls, and this is just one example, that Canadians consistently say they want something to be done about climate disturbances, and so it's our job. And it's not just about this. That's one foreign policy issue. In the case of mining companies, I haven't seen a poll on this issue, but I would strongly suggest that most of the public is made very uncomfortable by hearing stories of destructive Canadian mining operations abroad. I would venture to guess you're talking about 70 or 80% of the population that when hearing stories about Infinity Gold in Costa Rica, or Gold Core in Honduras, or many other ones, they're made very uncomfortable by that. We know that one CBC poll said that the vast majority of Canadians wanted Canada to support Palestine's observer status at the UN. Most Canadians, or the vast majority of those polled, didn't want Canada to take sides, didn't want the Harper government to be so pro-Israel. So what I'm basically trying to get at here is that when you take attitudes on a lot of these foreign policy issues, which for the most part people know fairly little about, but when you take attitudes, most people's attitudes are a lot closer to a good position than is the Canadian government's position. And that provides opportunity for activists, right? And in the case of the Kyoto Protocol is probably the best example. It seems to me that if most Canadians are unaware, and when made aware are not unhappy about Canada pulling out of the Kyoto Protocol, that would be something that activists could target a riding, a riding where a Conservative MP won by small numbers of votes in the lead up to the next election, and put up 20,000 posters around the riding, hand out 100,000 leaflets talking about Canada withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol, talking about the consequences, the real consequences, the fact that the Climate Vulnerability Monitor, and Climate Vulnerability Monitor is not some sort of obscure, this is over 20 governments that have launched the initiative. This is mainstream science, and talking about the human toll already of climate disturbances. So there's opportunity there for activists, for activism to have an impact. One poll shows that, another Leger marketing poll shows that 64% of Canadians said that, quote, our country's reputation in the world was, quote, very important to them. 64%. 29% said it was, quote, somewhat important to them. On a list of 12 different, the same poll showed a list of 12 different symbols, achievements, and attributes. Canada's reputation in the world was the second most important after healthcare. The least important were the monarchy and the War of 1812. Pretty reasonable. That's a pretty reasonable attitude, you know. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and it's for us to do what we can to take advantage of that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Yves, for sharing a lot of information. You can get a lot more by looking at Yves' books, but also drawing attention to the low level of literacy, because that in and of itself speaks to the importance of the kind of scholarship and writing that looks at that and shares that. But we have about half an hour for, we have the room until 6 for questions, discussion on the vast amount of material that Yves has shared with us, and some perspectives on that, as well as looking at some of the implications as we were putting forward in the announcement for the meeting, is what does it mean for us as Canadians. So the floor is open, it's yours.
Thank you very much for that talk. You seem to have a very simplistic view of foreign policy, a very benevolent view of foreign policy. And my feelings, I think foreign policy is more about protecting one's national interests. So I argue that, whatever is doing speaking, is still the national interest. Because where the southern part of the world come from, when you talk about free trade, it's still not free. Fair trade is not fair. So foreign aid is not aid at all. It's aid towards ensuring our national interests. From that perspective, for me, journalists do speak. Countries were doing those things like that. But for the sake of arguments, what's wrong? What's wrong?
Yeah, I mean, there was there's a time in history where it was seen as reasonable for Europeans to take Africans across the ocean, and that was the national interest to defend that. It was a time when colonialism was defended as national interest. I think that what we have to look at is whose national interest. When we talk about national interest, who are we talking about? Do most people in Vancouver benefit when Goldcorp, Vancouver company, goes into a community in Latin America and destroys the water systems? I don't know. I mean, there's certainly some people in Vancouver that benefit from it. There would be There would be Goldcorp office. I'm sure there's some secretaries that have jobs there and might be okay jobs. There would be cleaning staff in the office that would job. There would be different. There would be different people that have some manager. There would be some people who have some jobs from it that would benefit from it. But most of the people who are benefiting from that are the stockholders and the CEOs and stuff of Goldcorp. So when we talk about national interest, we have to look at who's defining the national interest. And my reading of Canadian foreign policy is it's the elite. It's a very small sliver of Canadian society that define what is Canadian foreign policy, more so than other elements of like domestic policy. Popular sectors, the working class, have more impact on domestic issues. Right? There are forces in this country, unions, different social groups that make it so on domestic issues, there are the majority of the population has a bit more of a voice. On foreign policy, because these issues are so removed from our day-to-day life, we have almost no idea what our government's doing even. The Canadian government can basically say anything it wants to say, but what it's doing in Haiti. It can have no relationship with reality. But who's been to Haiti? The extent that we know what's going on is based upon what the Globe and Mail or the Vancouver Sun probably doesn't even report on Haiti, but the Globe and Mail barely. It's so easy to confuse us and distort what's going on foreign policy, much more than on domestic issues, right? When business lobbyists say that if you increase the minimum wage by $1, if you make BC's minimum wage $11, as they just did in Ontario, that the world will end, and they do that, and they freak out about increasing minimum wage. When they say that, when you've worked the minimum wage, when you have family members that have worked the minimum wage, you kind of take it with a bit of a grain of salt and say, yeah, it might have some whatever, right? But when they say similar things about foreign policy, we have so little to root what's being said, and so it's an element of the element of social policy that's most in the hands of the corporate community, of the foreign affairs establishment. I think part of what I see is what's needed to be done is reclaiming the national interest from below, if you like.
And one thing to just draw attention, I have a speaker here and there, is that on national interest, we once were framing the idea of Canada's policy being tied to human security and not national security. So that raises the same questions that Yves is saying. How do we define what that is? One, and then there.
I'm from Bangladesh originally, so I know, I'm living in Canada almost 8 years, so I know both part. And yeah, the people in Bangladesh are suffering a lot due to climate change. Recently, in the last 5 years, it been 3 big storms. Yes, or I would say 20% of the countries and close to the ocean, not even more barriers and things. And yeah, we're not getting any international real support. Like people are throwing money here and there, it's not solving the problem. And on the other hand, like big companies like Agro and SNC are very, very Bangladesh, and they are involved with lots of big corruptions where really greed is not going anywhere because of they're bribing the ministers. When I talk to like young people, it's very strange. I was like, they are upset with Agro or SNC Bangladesh, but they're mainly upset with the global setting. So like basically the population density in Bangladesh is 1,033 plus, and it's more than 1,000 per square kilometer. Whereas when they saw the population density in Canada at 3, they always think that it's an unjust system. Because a young person, if you want to open a poultry farm and want to purchase a land like this, will never actually earn enough money by doing a lot of low value work to earn this piece of land in Bangladesh. It's impossible. So how do you think how can you answer those questions and somewhere else?
Well, I would say go up north in February, and then go to Ottawa in February, as I just came from, and questions of. But yeah, I don't. I mean, I don't. I don't really have a response around population density and the sort of injustice of that. But it's a different kind of landscape. But yeah, SNC-Lavalin, on the other hand, that's an interesting example of a Canadian company that's involved in corruption from Libya to everywhere, and the World Bank, CEDA have both said they were going to stop the World Bank. I think it's 10 years, 20 the most restrictive policy with no association with SNC-Lavalin. And just a couple weeks ago, it came out in, I think it was in Barbados, where the Canadian High Commission in Barbados was lobbying on behalf of SNC-Lavalin to get this contract. That was a shady deal. Anyways, example of a Canadian company that's involved in all kinds of dubious affairs abroad.
3, 4, 5, 6. So we'll see what we do. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There.
I wonder if you could point out the more specific connection in Canada's relationship to Israel, the more specific relationship to the extractive industry of natural gas under the Mediterranean. Of all of the interests that Canada has in forming a relationship with Israel, with that, one of the strongest is the fact that there are millions and millions of dollars worth of gas under the Mediterranean, which is by presumption owned by the state of Israel, but under international law, in fact, a good deal of it is in fact owned by Palestine, which as a state cannot support it. So while we're not necessarily pleased to see the extraction of that oil by any state, nevertheless, if it's going to be extracted, we should be as interested in seeing that wealth accrue to Palestinian owners as to Israeli owners.
I don't have a whole lot more to add from what you said, but I mean, I know there were some of the company executives that were on the trip with Harper that were had those interests in play. But I actually, I mean, broadly speaking, I see some stuff in it, but I don't have anything more really to add than that, which is an important. This is sort of one more example of the injustice that Palestinians face, where their water and their natural resources get stolen from them by Israel, and the Canadian government has largely supported that process.
Say Canada's reputation is deteriorating for very good reasons why. On the other hand, Canadians hold our reputation for important. And does that mean then the current government is in a balancing act between satisfying the needs of the corporate sector and other specific groups? At the same time, one needs to ensure that the awareness of that reputation is not amongst Canadians. And so, do you think they really are balancing that, or do they not really care about it?
I mean, I think that they to a certain extent they are balancing it. Like I think in the case of Haiti and after the earthquake, there was, as an example, there was just a sort of outpouring of horror or sense of solidarity in this country that the Canadian government had to act. So that was sort of a popular opinion, I think, very widely held. And then how does that get translated at Foreign Affairs? That gets translated into, okay, we have to do something, and what we really care about is controlling Haiti. So what we're going to do is send 2,000 troops, and then we're going to talk about how great it was that we sent 2,000 troops, which I wouldn't say the Canadian troops didn't do anything of use. They clearly did some things of use. There's a certain infrastructure that the military has. It's not to be denied that they didn't do anything of use. But was that what should have been sent? Was that really what was needed afterwards? And then, secondarily, is this just one more step of this history of foreigners, controlling Haiti?
So that would be one example where the government does have to navigate on the question of something like mining, where it's not really, unfortunately, if you read the left-wing press and online sources, there's just example after example of Canadian mining companies causing incredible abuses. If you were to do a detailed study of the Vancouver Sun, over the past 10 years, there would probably be, I don't know, let's go for a dozen stories about Canadian mining companies doing something dubious abroad. So if you read the paper really closely and you clip all those, then you'll have 12 examples just in the Vancouver Sun. This is something that needs to be dealt with. But it's most people are not doing that, and most people are not aware of just the scope of the problem. Hence, why should we bother bringing in legislation like Bill C-300 that says that we won't give government support to companies that do abuses? Because most people don't even know these abuses are happening. So it's a little bit different with each issue. You have to take a little bit look at it kind of closely. But in the case of mining is an example, I think, where it's just there's very powerful corporate interests that don't want any restrictions on what they're doing and want this promotion, which is what the kingdom is doing. Even though probably popular attitudes would be very strongly hostile to what the government's doing, it's so weakly held, and it's so ill-informed, those popular attitudes, that the government can basically do what it wants.
We have 3 or 4 more. We're running late, so if I could ask you to maybe put a point in a question briefly, and we'll try and take stock of it, and then Yves can comment on it. That's probably the fairest way to accommodate the interest. Because all hands shut up at once. Okay, so if we could do it that way.
Hi, my name is Elaine Boyd. Mine is pretty short. Thank you for your talk, Yves. What I found really fascinating about your talk is trying to find out the reasons behind the actions of the Harper government and their foreign policy initiatives. And my short comment is in regards to the reasons behind the foreign policy actions on mining, like protecting the mining interests abroad. And one that I don't know if you checked on was that corporate mining corporations, Canadian mining corporations abroad, part of our pension fund is funded by the profit of those mining corporations.
Yeah.
Why don't we take these, and I'll bring some notes
Okay.
as a little prompter for you. 1, 2.
I guess just wondering about, the fact that, some of the things, like the mining things, you can see that there is a sort of a pragmatic reason that the Canadian government might act that way. But looking at what's happened with Canada's international reputation, not getting voted onto the Security Council, being shut out of the whole Latin American thing because we're seen as so obviously biased, the total lack of anybody thinking that Canada has any legitimate neutral position in the Middle East, doesn't it seem like it should be kind of clearer to the Canadian government that it's going to lose influence by taking these really extreme positions for idealistic reasons?
Okay. One more, and then 2, and then another
I
one.
just want to sort of ask how immigration policy and just sort of the relationship immigrant settlers have with the Indigenous people here, with the broader foreign policy that the Canadian government has. Just a broad question about immigration and St. Harper's government's towards it, and also the issue of complicity and what we as Canadians can do in our different institutions to combat this beyond voting, beyond activism.
Okay, and the last one, and then I'll pass it to you, and I have some notes.
I think you gave a good example of why the Canadian education has been concerned with the rating. That this is your information about all the domestic expectation for the government. There also seems like a distance between what Canadian wants and what government is doing. The question is what is allowing this kind of government system that having a distance between what Canadians did want to like how come the government can't do one like this kind of
Well, so that it's not a full democracy, I guess would be kind of the right. I mean that again, I would kind of repeat, but what allows that to happen? I mean, everything from the fact that who owns most of the media in this country, rich people. Where do they get most of their revenue from? Corporate advertising, which is big companies. I mean, it's that's very simple. So what do we hear about foreign affairs? Right? What's the main source of international or a main source of international news for reporters in this country? It's the government. They go to foreign affairs and ask, or Canadian diplomats, they go ask what's happening in that place. So there's big structural reasons, like the media. There's the different institutes, right? Mining companies involved in the Gold Corps is involved in the Liu Institute. Peter Munk, the head of Baird Gold, it owns sponsored the creation of the Munk Center, a major international affairs institute at the University of Toronto. He has very clear self-interest in Canadian foreign policy. So and then it's the questions of everything from most people don't have any connection to the different places, and so don't have a sense of things, to, quite frankly, it's not the most pressing issue because it's not, day-to-day issues of oneself tend to take precedence over, what's happening to people elsewhere, even if it's, bad things happening. So there's, a whole series of reasons like that. Somebody can't. Somebody has very good handwriting, but
should have been a doctor. The first one was immigration policy.
Immigration policy. I mean, clearly the Harper government is making. There's a sort of tightening of immigration policy in a way that's not particularly humane, and I think that flows. Is not a coincidence that the same governments that are the biggest promoters of so-called free trade also, right? Questions of what to do with regards to foreign policy. I mean, I think that what we need to do is everything from the voting options to the activism options. There's a couple thousand Stop Harper's Crime stickers that talk about some different foreign policy issues. Putting those things up, organizing events, actions like the action of disrupting Harper's speech on climate issues. The list is endless. A lot of the work is just education because people are so unaware. But it needs to be education tied into actions that.
And then there's immigration policy as well.
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit.
So there's a question on what are the reasons do we have a stake because of corporations and pension funds?
The pension. I would say that's. I mean, I think that people we should be. We're all complicit in the sense that. At one level, in the sense of like Canadian mining companies abroad, when the CPP is invested in the Toronto Stock Exchange, and the Toronto Stock Exchange is dominated by mining companies that are often involved in abuses. But I think that's a little bit. I don't think my stake in I'm not sure exactly what my CPP stake in Barrick Gold is. It's probably I have a I have probably a 20-cent share of Barrick Gold, right? That's very little compared to Peter Monk's, $1 billion stake in Barrick Gold. So yes, the Canadian government, probably has some concern about, there's some concern about, making the CPP's investments go up and the impact that has on retirement. But I don't think that's not the driving force here. The driving force is. The CEOs and the main the 0.1% of stockholders who own most of the stock, not just sort of average Canadians who have I don't know, $2 invested in via their CPP investments in different mining companies.
And the other one that wasn't explicitly, we kind of touched on it, was why do we do this if we're clearly losing influence?
Yeah, well, losing influence. I mean, is the Canadian government losing influence? Different issues. I mean, the Harper government, on the question of Palestine, for instance, there is you can maybe argue there's a loss of influence, in certain UN forums. Canada is just seen as so obviously just the tool of sort of Israeli policy. But if you're in the case of the Harper government, if you're committed to Western imperialism, if you have a Christian Zionist base, if you're trying to woo over sectors of the Jewish community that are some of the pro-Israel sectors of the Jewish community, taking these pro-Israel positions, maybe loses you some influence with UN forums, but is serves their interest. In the case of mining companies abroad, or in the case of climate negotiations, yes, the Harper government is seen as an outlier in different climate negotiations, but they care about tar sands interests. They don't care about world opinion. So influence is not what they're looking for. It's the profit margins of their friends. It's really not much more complicated than that. They don't, example like Haiti, the decision makers in Ottawa just don't care what Haitians think. You can have 99% of Haitians that think that Canada is the worst thing the world's ever seen. Just doesn't bother them, so long as that is not translated into any sort of power. And unfortunately, in the case of Haiti, the popular opinion of the vast majority of Haitians means, in terms of power, it means almost nothing. If we were to echo the voice of popular opinion in Haiti, that might bother the Harper government and the Canadian government. But for the most part, Canadians are unaware of popular opinion in Haiti. Hence,
Well, because we were so disciplined, one hand has shot up. If it's,
Sorry,
it's
just wanted
but
to
it
make
didn't.
about the pension thing. I think there's a lot of investment in creating pension funds in mining companies, and I think Council Canadians was running a campaign to divest your pension, and I think you can do that. So just another thing.
Can you go up with announcement?
Yeah, sure. Well, just before, I'm going to make one announcement. Why don't we start to wrap up and then have a couple of announcements? First, I'd really like to thank Yves for sharing this perspective on a really important issue. One of the things in the School of Population and Public Health you talk about are upstream factors. I mean, there's the things where you're really looking at health and you're looking at diagnosis and treatment, but then you say, well, let's start to look at prevention. So you look at the things that legally say proximal, well, it's your behavior. Well, maybe your options are really skewed. Maybe there's something a little distant, but then there's driving forces and the context. Why is this in the School of Population and Public Health? Because what the context is for how we navigate life and in our families, in our communities, in our country, in a global sense, all has a huge bearing. So thanks, Yves, for sharing that perspective. And for more information, there's the 2 books and perhaps some other materials, and we'll have some time to talk afterwards. Now, there's 2 announcements that I'm aware of that I also wanted to share. One is, maybe the same one, but there's a Just Film Festival that people were circulating some flyers. It used to be known, I knew it as CODEV, but it's the same kind of grouping together of films with a similar perspective on looking critically at the interests of people around the world. We have one other announcement and then a final word.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be at that festival actually, but my announcement is about the spin-off program at the beginning of March. We're going to have the visitors from community from Guatemala. It's a community that is affected by the Cajoy mining company, which is located in Vancouver. And it's the Marine Justice Alliance website. So it's the day of March, the whole week, and the students from UBC and SAQ, they're going to be involved in organizing that with those kids.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Thanks again to Yves for sharing these perspectives with us, and thanks to all of you for coming out. Thanks.
And if anyone's interested, I have some of my books here on sale, and there's the Stop Harper's Crime stickers as well.